June 24, 1943, 10 o'clock at night, Bamber Bridge, Lancashire, England. Inside Ye Olde Hob Inn, laughter mingles with cigarette smoke and the clink of beer glasses. American voices blend with Lancashire accents in a chorus of wartime camaraderie that would be impossible anywhere else. Black soldiers of the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment sit shoulder to shoulder with British civilians, British servicewomen, and local factory workers. They share jokes, swap stories, and for a few precious hours, forget the weight of the uniforms they wear and the war that brought them here. Private Eugene Nunn leans against the bar, his field jacket unbuttoned, relaxed in a way he never could be back home in Alabama. A British woman laughs at something he said, her hand briefly touching his arm in easy friendship. Around them, a dozen other black GIs enjoy the same simple pleasure, being treated like human beings, being welcomed, being seen as soldiers and allies rather than problems to be managed or threats to be contained. Outside, two jeeps roll slowly down the darkening street. White stars painted on their hoods mark them as American military vehicles. The letters MP stenciled on their sides identify their occupants as men with a very different mission than the infantry, or the airmen, or the truck drivers. These are the enforcers, the men who make sure everyone stays in their place. The jeeps slow as they pass the pub. Through the windows, the MPs can see what they've been seeing for months now, what fills them with a resentment they barely bother to hide anymore. Black soldiers mixing freely with whites. Worse, black soldiers talking with white women, British women who don't seem to understand or care about the natural order of things, who treat these men as equals, who sometimes even prefer their company. Corporal Roy Windsor sits behind the wheel of the first jeep, his jaw tight. Beside him, Private Ralph Ridgway shakes his head. They've had enough complaints, enough reports of disturbances, enough reasons to finally do something about the situation in this village that refuses to respect American customs. Ridgway steps out of the jeep and pushes through the pub door. The warm atmosphere hits him immediately, but he's not here for the hospitality. His eyes scan the room, cataloging violations. Black soldiers in improper uniform. Black soldiers drinking with whites. Black soldiers acting like they belong here. Windsor follows him in, his hand resting on his holster. He spots Eugene Nunn immediately. The field jacket instead of the proper Class A uniform gives him all the justification he needs. He crosses the room, his presence cutting through conversations like a knife. You, soldier, you're improperly dressed. You're coming with us. The pub goes quiet. Nunn straightens, his easy smile fading. He knows this moment. Every black soldier in Britain knows this moment. The moment when white authority reasserts itself, when the brief illusion of equality shatters, when you're reminded that no matter how far you travel from Mississippi or Georgia or Alabama, Jim Crow travels with you. I'm not bothering anyone, Nunn says quietly, just having a drink before closing time. I didn't ask if you were bothering anyone. I'm telling you you're under arrest, let's go. A British soldier stands up from a nearby table, his face flushed with beer and indignation. Why do you want to arrest him? He's not bothering anybody. Leave him alone. Other voices join in. British voices. The landlord steps forward, positioning himself between Windsor and Nunn. A British servicewoman calls out that the American MPs have no right to come in here causing trouble. The solidarity is immediate, instinctive, and completely unexpected. Windsor's hand moves to his pistol. This is military business. Stay out of it. Private Lynn Adams, another black soldier from the 1511th, pushes through the crowd, a beer bottle gripped in his hand. His eyes are hard, his posture aggressive. He's tired of this. Tired of being treated like a criminal in his own uniform. Tired of watching his brothers be humiliated and arrested for the crime of existing in spaces white people have decided they shouldn't occupy. You're not taking him anywhere, Adams says. The tension in the room becomes electric. British civilians press closer, forming a human barrier. The MPs are outnumbered, surrounded by hostile faces in a foreign country that's supposed to be Allied territory. For a moment, violence seems inevitable. Then Staff Sergeant Bird, a black NCO with enough stripes to command respect, steps between the groups. His voice is calm but firm. Let's all take a breath here. Nobody needs to get arrested. Nobody needs to get hurt. MPs, these men are off duty and heading back to base soon anyway. No need to make this into something it doesn't have to be. Windsor and Ridgway exchange glances. They're outmaneuvered for now, but this isn't over. Windsor holsters his weapon, and jerks his head toward the door. "We'll be back," he says, his voice carrying a promise and a threat. As the MPs push back through the crowd toward their jeep, Lynn Adams follows them outside. The beer bottle is still in his hand. As the jeep starts to pull away, he hurls it with all his strength. Glass explodes across the windscreen, spiderwebbing the safety glass and forcing Windsor to slam on the brakes. The jeep stops. Windsor and Ridgway turn to stare back at Adams, at the pub, at the crowd of black soldiers and British civilians now spilling out onto the street. Then Windsor guns the engine and the jeep disappears into the darkness. Inside the pub, the black soldiers look at each other with a grim understanding. This isn't the end. This is the beginning. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what brought these men to this small Lancashire village in the first place, and why a confrontation over a field jacket could escalate into the only battle American soldiers fought against each other on British soil during the entire Second World War. The 11th Quartermaster Truck Regiment arrived in Britain as part of the massive American military buildup that would eventually put more than 1.5 million U.S. troops on British soil. Of those troops, approximately 130,000 were black Americans, serving in a rigidly segregated military that reflected the Jim Crow laws of their home country. These men wore the same uniform as their white counterparts. They swore the same oath. They served the same flag. But they did not serve as equals. Black soldiers were overwhelmingly assigned to service and supply units, relegated to the unglamorous work of loading trucks, building bases, cooking meals, and handling logistics. Combat roles were reserved almost exclusively for white soldiers. The message was clear. Black men were good enough to support the war effort, but not good enough to fight. The segregation went beyond unit assignments. On American bases, black and white soldiers used separate facilities, ate in separate mess halls, and relaxed in separate recreation areas. When they went into nearby towns, military police enforced an unofficial but very real color bar, attempting to designate certain pubs and establishments as white only or black only. The American military command knew this would be a problem in Britain. Before the first black troops arrived, the War Department sent instructions to British authorities about how to handle the situation. Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, received warnings that racial mixing would cause trouble. Some American officers suggested that the British should adopt American-style segregation to avoid conflict. The British response was mixed. Churchill's government, desperate for American support and wary of offending their powerful ally, issued some guidance suggesting that British civilians should respect American racial customs. But the British people themselves had very different ideas. Britain in 1943 was not a racial paradise. The country had its own history of imperialism and racism, its own prejudices and blind spots. But it did not have Jim Crow laws. It did not have legal segregation. And when British civilians encountered black American soldiers for the first time, many of them were shocked and appalled by how these men were treated by their own countrymen. A British woman wrote in her diary, "Everybody here adores the Negro troops. They are so much more polite and considerate than the white Americans." Another observer noted, "The general consensus of opinion seems to be that the only American soldiers with decent manners are the Negroes." The phrase that captured British sentiment most perfectly was repeated in pubs and parlors across the country. "I don't mind the Yanks, but I don't care much for the white fellows they've brought with them." For black soldiers, the contrast between their treatment in Britain and their treatment at home was staggering. They could walk into a pub and be served without question. They could sit next to white people on buses and trains without being ordered to move. They could talk to white women without fear of lynching. British families invited them to Sunday dinners. British children played with them in the streets. British women danced with them at social events. The letters black soldiers sent home reflected their amazement. One soldier wrote, "The people here don't seem to know any color line." Another described being treated like a human being for the first time in my life. They wrote about eating in restaurants, staying in hotels, and being welcomed into British homes, experiences that would have been impossible in most of America. This taste of equality was intoxicating and dangerous. It showed these men what life could be like. It expanded what the historian David Reynolds called their sense of the possible, and it made returning to American-style segregation, even on an American base in Britain, increasingly intolerable. Bamber Bridge was a small village of a few thousand people, built along the River Ribble in Lancashire. Stone cottages lined narrow streets. 3 pubs served as social centers. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where strangers were noticed and newcomers were either welcomed or shunned based on how they behaved. When the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment set up at Adam Hall, the requisition to state on Mountsey Road that the Americans designated Air Force Station 569, the people of Bamber Bridge did what they always did with soldiers. They welcomed them. The black soldiers were invited into homes, included in community events, and treated as the allies they were. The trouble started when white American soldiers, bothered by seeing black soldiers socializing freely with British civilians, and especially with British women, attempted to establish a color bar in the village pubs. They pressured landlords to refuse service to black soldiers or to designate certain nights as whites only. The landlord's response became legendary. Rather than exclude the black soldiers who had been nothing but polite and respectful, several pub owners hung signs reading, "Black troops only." If anyone was going to be excluded, it would be the white Americans who were trying to import their racism into a British village. This act of solidarity enraged white American soldiers, and especially the military police. The 234th U.S. Military Police Company, responsible for maintaining order and discipline among American troops in the region, found themselves in an impossible position. Their job was to enforce military regulations and, unofficially, to maintain racial segregation. But they were trying to do this in a country where the local population actively resisted those efforts and sided with the black soldiers. The resentment festered. White MPs watched black soldiers walk freely through Bamber Bridge, saw them laughing with British women, witnessed the respect and friendship the villagers showed them. Every smile, every friendly conversation, every moment of equality was a challenge to the racial hierarchy the MPs were supposed to maintain. By late June 1943, the situation was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came on the evening of June 24th, when Roy Windsor and Ralph Ridgway decided they'd had enough of the disrespect and disorder in Bamber Bridge and drove their Jeep to Ye Old Hob Inn to restore proper discipline. After the MP's Jeep disappears into the night, its windscreen shattered by Lynn Adams's beer bottle, the black soldiers of the 1511th stand in the street outside the pub, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They know what's coming. The MPs won't let this go. There will be arrests, probably violence, possibly worse. Some of the men head back toward Adam Hall, walking in groups for safety. Others linger, talking in low voices with British civilians who are angry on their behalf, who can't understand why American soldiers would treat their own countrymen this way. Around 10:25 that night, a group of about 12 black soldiers walking back to base along one of Bamber Bridge's quiet residential streets encounters a force of military police. Windsor and Ridgway have called for backup. Now there are 4 MPs and they're not interested in talking. The MPs order the soldiers to halt. They demand to know who threw the bottle. They announce that arrests will be made. The soldiers refuse to cooperate, refuse to identify anyone, refuse to accept that they've done anything wrong. The argument escalates quickly. Voices rise. The soldiers are surrounded but not intimidated. They outnumber the MPs 3-1. Some of them have been drinking. All of them are tired of being pushed around. Someone throws a punch, then another. The fight spills across the narrow street, past the terraced houses where British families peer nervously from behind blackout curtains. The soldiers fight with fists and beer bottles. One of them grabs cobblestones from Mrs. Emily Dimmock's garden wall and hurls them at the MPs. Then a gunshot cracks through the night. Private Lynn Adams, the same man who threw the bottle at the MP Jeep, staggers backward, his hand going to his neck. Blood streams between his fingers. An MP has shot him. Another shot. Another black soldier falls, hit in the back as he tries to help Adams. The violence that had been building for months, the rage and humiliation and injustice, explodes in that moment. The remaining soldiers scatter, some running toward base, others taking cover, all of them understanding that this has crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. The MPs have opened fire on American soldiers, on their own men. The wounded are dragged away from the scene. Adams is bleeding badly, the bullet having torn through the side of his neck. The other soldier, shot in the back, is conscious but in shock. They need medical attention immediately. 2 American officers happen to drive past in a Jeep. The soldiers flag them down, desperate, explaining that men have been shot and need to get to the hospital. The officers look at the wounded black soldiers, look at each other, and refuse. They drive away, leaving the wounded men bleeding in the street. This refusal, this casual cruelty, this absolute indifference to the lives of soldiers wearing the same uniform will be remembered. It will be cited in official reports. It will become one of the most damning details of the entire incident. The soldiers commandeer their own vehicles. They load the wounded into jeeps and drive them to the hospital themselves, racing through the dark streets, praying their brothers don't bleed out before they get there. Back at Adam Hall, the men who witnessed the shooting burst into the barracks, waking sleeping soldiers with urgent shouts. The story spreads like wildfire, growing more terrible with each retelling. The MPs shot Adams. They shot him in the back. They're hunting for more of us. They're coming to the base. Within minutes, approximately 200 black soldiers gather in the base yard. They're angry, frightened, and convinced that if they don't stand together, they'll be picked off one by one. The normal military hierarchy begins to break down. When Major Harris and Captain Anderson, white officers, order the men back to their barracks, the orders are ignored. Lieutenant Jones, the 1511th's only black officer, tries to calm the situation. He's caught between his duty as an officer and his identity as a black man who understands exactly why these soldiers are refusing to stand down. His words have some effect, but not enough. The men are too angry, too scared, too convinced that submission means death. Around 11:30, a convoy of MP jeeps arrives at the base gates. The MPs have brought reinforcements and improvised armor. One vehicle has been fitted with a mounted machine gun, turning it into a makeshift armored car. The message is clear. The military police are prepared to use overwhelming force. The sight of that machine gun, pointed at American soldiers by other American soldiers, makes the situation real in a way nothing else has. This isn't just a fight outside a pub anymore. This is the United States military preparing to open fire on its own troops. Some of the black soldiers break into the Adam Hall Armory. They emerge with rifles, pistols, and ammunition. If the MPs are armed, they reason, then they need to be armed too. If this is going to be a battle, they're not going to face it defenseless. First Sergeants Fred Davis and George Patterson, the highest-ranking black NCOs in the unit, confront Captain Anderson. Patterson's voice shakes with fury and grief. "Captain, who shot my man? By God, I'm going to find out who shot my man." Anderson has no answer. He's lost control of his unit. His orders are being ignored. His men are armed and preparing to fight. Not the Germans, but other Americans. Everything he was trained for, every leadership principle he learned, is useless in this moment. Around midnight, several trucks loaded with armed black soldiers crash through the base gates. They're not fleeing. They're going hunting. They're going to find the MPs who shot their brothers. They're going to make someone answer for this. What follows is chaos. For hours, sporadic gunfire echoes through the streets of Bamber Bridge. Black soldiers and white MPs exchange shots at multiple locations across the village. Bullets chip stone walls and shatter windows. British civilians huddle in their homes, terrified and confused, caught in the middle of an American Civil War being fought on their streets. Some British families, despite the danger, shelter black soldiers who knock on their doors seeking cover. The solidarity that started in the pubs continues even under fire. The villagers have chosen their side. The battle is disorganized, chaotic, nothing like the coordinated military operations these men have trained for. It's urban warfare fought by soldiers who never expected to be shooting at each other, in a village that never expected to become a battlefield. Private William Crossland of the 1511th is killed in the fighting. Several other soldiers and MPs are wounded. The exact sequence of events becomes impossible to reconstruct. Who shot first? Who shot Crossland? In the darkness and confusion, with adrenaline and fear driving every action, the truth fragments into competing narratives. As dawn approaches, exhaustion and the reality of casualties force an unofficial ceasefire. The black soldiers, running low on ammunition and sobered by Crossland's death, return to Adam Hall. The MPs, shaken by the ferocity of the resistance and the realization that they nearly sparked a full-scale mutiny, pull back to regroup. British authorities and senior American commanders arrive as the sun rises over Bamber Bridge. They survey the damage. Bullet holes in buildings, shattered glass, blood on the cobblestones, and one dead American soldier. Not killed by Germans or Japanese, but by other Americans, in a battle over the right to drink in a pub without being arrested for the color of your skin. The morning of June 25th brings military police in force, securing Adam Hall and the surrounding area. The black soldiers of the 1500th, exhausted and grieving, are confined to base. Investigations begin immediately, statements are taken, evidence is collected, and the blame, predictably, is directed squarely at the black soldiers. The official narrative takes shape quickly. A group of undisciplined black soldiers, possibly drunk, attacked military police who were simply trying to enforce regulations. The soldiers rioted, seized weapons, and engaged in mutinous behavior. One of their own was killed in the chaos they created. They are responsible for this disaster. Arrests follow. Dozens of black soldiers are taken into custody and charged with various offenses: disobeying orders, rioting, mutiny, seizing government property, and assault. The military justice system moves with impressive speed when it wants to. 2 separate courts-martial are convened. The first trial involves 4 African American soldiers who are found guilty and sentenced to dishonorable discharges and terms of hard labor. The message is clear: resistance will be crushed, and those who resist will be made examples. The second trial is larger, involving 35 defendants. 28 of them are convicted on various charges. The sentences vary, but all involve punishment designed to destroy these men's military careers and mark them as criminals for the rest of their lives. In a particularly cruel irony, Private William Crossland, the soldier killed during the incident, is posthumously found guilty of riotous behavior. Even in death, he is labeled a criminal rather than a victim. But something unexpected happens as the trials proceed and senior officers review the evidence. The official narrative begins to crack. Too many witnesses describe MPs as the aggressors. Too many British civilians testify to the unprovoked nature of the initial confrontation. Too many details don't fit the story of undisciplined black soldiers attacking innocent military police. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Army Air Force and one of the most senior American officers in Britain, personally reviews the case. What he finds disturbs him. The evidence clearly shows that racist military police, not black soldiers, were primarily responsible for the escalation. The MP's aggressive enforcement of segregation in a country that didn't practice it created the conditions for conflict. Their use of firearms against soldiers who were initially unarmed was unjustified, and the refusal of white officers to transport wounded black soldiers was unconscionable. Eaker's report is damning. He criticizes the racist attitudes of the MPs involved. He condemns the white officers who mishandled the situation and those who refused to help wounded men. He recommends significant changes to prevent similar incidents. The consequences of Eaker's findings are revolutionary for the American military in 1943. Racist officers are removed from positions of authority over black trucking units. More significantly, black officers are introduced into military police units for the first time in that region. The idea is that black MPs might be able to maintain discipline among black soldiers without the racial antagonism that white MPs brought to every interaction. This change, forced by the violence in Bamber Bridge, represents a small but significant crack in the edifice of military segregation. It's not equality, not by a long shot, but it's an acknowledgement that the current system isn't working and that black soldiers deserve at least some representation in the enforcement structure. For the black soldiers of the 1500th who weren't convicted, life returns to a tense normalcy. They continue their work, loading trucks and moving supplies, doing the unglamorous labor that keeps armies functioning. But something has changed. They've seen what resistance looks like. They've experienced British civilians standing with them against American racism. They've learned that they don't have to accept every humiliation, every injustice, every casual cruelty. The British civilians of Bamber Bridge never waver in their support. Despite the violence, despite the danger, despite pressure from American authorities, the villagers maintain their solidarity with the black soldiers. The pubs continue to welcome them. Families continue to invite them to dinner. The Black Troops Only signs stay up. British servicewomen, who were present during the initial confrontation, give statements supporting the black soldiers' version of events. They describe the MPs as aggressive and provocative. They confirm that the black soldiers were not causing any trouble before the MPs arrived. Their testimony, from white British women, carries weight that the testimony of black American men never could. George Orwell, writing in his column in December 1943, captures the British perspective. The general consensus of opinion seems to be that the only American soldiers with decent manners are the Negroes. His observation reflects a widespread British sentiment that the real problem isn't black soldiers, but the white Americans who treat them so badly. The historian David Olusoga, examining the incident decades later, notes that the British vehemently objected to the treatment of black GIs, and that this objection sometimes manifested in anti-American sentiment. The Bamber Bridge incident, while extreme, was part of a broader pattern of British civilians siding with black American soldiers against white American racism. The ripple effects of Bamber Bridge extend far beyond one small Lancashire village. News of the incident spreads through the network of American bases across Britain, carried by soldiers' letters and whispered conversations. Black soldiers at other bases hear about men who fought back, who refused to accept arrest, who stood their ground even when faced with machine guns. The incident forces changes in how military police interact with black soldiers. The introduction of black MPs, while limited, represents an acknowledgement that the old system of purely white enforcement of discipline over black soldiers is unsustainable. Commanders become more cautious about how they handle racial tensions, aware that another Bamber Bridge could spark something even larger. For the black soldiers who experienced British acceptance and then fought for their dignity in Bamber Bridge's streets, the war takes on a different meaning. They're still fighting against fascism abroad, still doing their part to defeat Hitler and Tojo, but they're also fighting a second war, a war for their own dignity and rights, a war against the American racism that follows them even to foreign soil. The letters they send home reflect this dual consciousness. They write about the war effort, about their duties, about missing their families, but they also write about being treated as equals in Britain, about British families who welcome them, about a world where skin color doesn't determine where you can sit, or drink, or walk. And some of them, like Private Joseph Curtis, write about what they plan to do when they return home. Curtis's letter is particularly striking. After the war, I shall start a movement to send white Americans back to England where they will be appreciated, and we American Negroes will stay in America where we belong and won't be appreciated. The bitter irony in his words captures the absurdity of the situation. Black Americans treated better in a foreign country than in their own homeland, fighting for freedoms they've never experienced. The historian David Reynolds argues that the experience of black soldiers in Britain expanded their sense of the possible. They saw what life could be like without Jim Crow. They experienced respect and dignity. And when they returned home after the war, many of them brought that expanded sense of possibility with them. They became activists, organizers, and participants in the civil rights movement that would eventually dismantle legal segregation. The connection between Bamber Bridge and the post-war civil rights movement is not direct or simple. The incident didn't cause the movement, but it was part of a larger pattern of experiences that radicalized black veterans, that made them unwilling to return to the status quo, that convinced them change was both necessary and possible. In 1948, 5 years after the Battle of Bamber Bridge, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially ending segregation in the United States military. The order didn't immediately transform the military, and implementation took years. But it represented a fundamental shift in official policy, an acknowledgement that the segregated system was both unjust and impractical. The road from Bamber Bridge to Executive Order 9981 runs through countless other incidents, protests, and acts of resistance by black soldiers during and after World War II. Bamber Bridge was one battle in a much longer war, but it was a significant battle, one that demonstrated both the depth of black soldiers' anger at their treatment and the possibility of white allies standing with them. For decades after the war, the Battle of Bamber Bridge was largely forgotten. It didn't fit neatly into narratives of American heroism in World War II. It was an embarrassment, a reminder of the racism that infected even the fight against fascism. Official records were buried. Participants rarely spoke about it. The village itself moved on, and a new generation grew up unaware of what had happened on their streets. But history has a way of resurfacing. Local historians in Bamber Bridge, particularly Clinton Smith and Professor Alan Rice, began researching the incident, interviewing elderly residents who remembered that night, digging through archives, and piecing together the story. Their work ensured that the Battle of Bamber Bridge wouldn't be lost to time. In 2022, nearly 80 years after the incident, a memorial was placed outside Ye Olde Hob Inn. The memorial honors the black soldiers of the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment and acknowledges the solidarity shown by the people of Bamber Bridge. It stands as a reminder that ordinary people in a small village chose justice over compliance, chose to stand with the oppressed rather than accept oppression. The memorial's placement outside the pub where the confrontation began is significant. Ye Olde Hob Inn still stands, still serves drinks, still welcomes customers, but now it also serves as a monument to a moment when a community refused to accept racism on its soil, when British civilians stood with Black American soldiers against white American military police, when the contradictions of fighting for freedom while denying it became too stark to ignore. Today, Bamber Bridge is a symbol. It represents the possibility of cross-racial solidarity, the power of ordinary people to resist injustice, and the courage of soldiers who fought two wars simultaneously, one against fascism abroad and one against racism at home. The Battle of Bamber Bridge lasted only one night, but its echoes continue. Every time someone stands up against discrimination, every time a community chooses solidarity over compliance, every time people refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable, they're fighting the same battle that erupted on those Lancashire streets in June 1943. Private William Crossland died in that battle. His name appears on the memorial outside Ye Olde Hob Inn, not as a mutineer or a criminal, but as a man who stood up for his dignity and paid the ultimate price. The military court-martial found him guilty of riotous behavior, even in death, but history has rendered a different verdict. Crossland and the other soldiers of the 1511th were not rioters or criminals. They were men pushed beyond endurance, men who had been promised that they were fighting for freedom and democracy while being denied both, men who finally said enough. Their resistance was not perfect or strategic or carefully planned. It was desperate and chaotic and costly, but it was also necessary. The white military police who sparked the confrontation believed they were maintaining order and discipline. They believed in the racial hierarchy they were enforcing. They couldn't understand why British civilians didn't share their beliefs, why the villagers sided with black soldiers, why their authority was being challenged. They saw themselves as the victims of black aggression rather than the perpetrators of systemic racism. The British civilians of Bamber Bridge saw the situation more clearly. They saw American soldiers, all of them, as allies who had come to help fight a war. They saw the black soldiers as polite, respectful, and grateful for hospitality. And they saw the white MPs as bullies trying to enforce rules that had no place in Britain. Their choice to stand with the black soldiers was not complicated or agonized. It was simply the right thing to do. The American military command, forced to confront the incident, struggled to reconcile competing imperatives. They needed to maintain discipline and order. They needed to preserve the racial hierarchy that most white officers believed was natural and necessary. But they also needed to prevent future incidents that could undermine the war effort and damage relations with their British hosts. General Eaker's solution, removing the most racist officers and introducing black MPs, was a compromise that satisfied no one but prevented immediate repetition of the violence. The Battle of Bamber Bridge reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of America's participation in World War II. The United States was fighting against Nazi racial ideology while maintaining its own system of racial oppression. Black soldiers were asked to risk their lives for a country that denied them basic rights, to fight for freedoms they had never experienced, to defend a democracy that excluded them. This contradiction was not abstract or theoretical. It played out in concrete ways every day, in segregated mess halls and barracks, in the refusal of white officers to transport wounded black soldiers, in the enforcement of Jim Crow laws on foreign soil, in the assumption that black soldiers were inherently more criminal and less disciplined than white soldiers. The black soldiers of the 1511th understood this contradiction intimately. They lived it every day, and on the night of June 24, 1943, they refused to accept it any longer. Their refusal was not a rejection of the war effort or a betrayal of their country. It was a demand that their country live up to its stated ideals, that the freedom and democracy they were fighting for should apply to them too. The people of Bamber Bridge understood something that many Americans then and now struggled to grasp, that you cannot fight for freedom while denying it to others, that racism undermines the moral authority of any cause, that justice is indivisible. Their solidarity with the black soldiers was not charity or condescension. It was recognition of shared humanity and shared struggle. The memorial outside Ye Olde Habe Inn stands as a testament to that recognition. It reminds visitors that history is not just made by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people making moral choices in difficult circumstances. It honors soldiers who fought for dignity as well as victory, and it celebrates a community that chose the right side of history. The Battle of Bamber Bridge did not end racism in the American military. It did not immediately transform race relations in the United States. It did not prevent countless other incidents of discrimination and violence against black soldiers during and after the war. But it mattered. It showed that resistance was possible. It demonstrated that white allies could stand with black people against injustice. It proved that the system of segregation could be challenged, even at great cost. For the soldiers who survived the battle and the courts-martial, life went on. Some returned to the United States after the war and resumed the lives they had left behind, carrying the memory of that night and the brief taste of equality they experienced in Britain. Others became activists, using their military service and their experiences abroad to demand change at home. All of them were changed by what happened in Bamber Bridge. The village itself returned to its quiet existence after the war. The American soldiers left. The bases closed. Life resumed its normal rhythms. But the memory persisted, passed down through families, preserved in local history, waiting to be rediscovered by new generations. That rediscovery has given the Battle of Bamber Bridge new relevance. In an era of renewed attention to racial justice, the story resonates. It offers a historical example of successful cross-racial solidarity. It demonstrates that ordinary people can resist systemic injustice. It shows that the struggle for civil rights has deep roots and many branches. The story also complicates simple narratives about World War II as the good war. It was a necessary war against genuine evil, but it was fought by a flawed nation that maintained its own systems of oppression. The soldiers who fought it were heroes, but they were also human beings navigating complex moral terrain. The victory was real and important, but it did not automatically translate into justice at home. Private Eugene Nunn, whose improper uniform sparked the initial confrontation, survived the battle and the war. In later years, he rarely spoke about what happened that night. The memory was too painful, too complicated, too difficult to explain to people who hadn't been there. But he never forgot the British civilians who stood with him, who refused to let the MPs take him, who chose solidarity over safety. Lynn Adams, who threw the beer bottle and was shot in the neck, also survived. The bullet missed his carotid artery by millimeters. He recovered from his wound but carried the scar for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the night he fought for his dignity and nearly died for it. The white MPs involved in the incident returned to their duties after giving statements and testifying at the courts-martial. Some of them believed until their dying days that they had been right, that they had simply been trying to maintain order and discipline, that the black soldiers were to blame for everything that happened. Others perhaps had doubts. Perhaps some of them in quiet moments wondered if they had been on the wrong side. The British civilians who sheltered black soldiers during the firefight, who testified on their behalf at the trials, who maintained their solidarity despite pressure and danger, became part of Bamber Bridge's proud history. Their children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories about the night their village stood up to racism, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. General Ira Eaker, whose investigation and report led to meaningful changes in military police practices, went on to a distinguished career. His willingness to look beyond the official narrative and acknowledge the role of racism in creating the Bamber Bridge incident was unusual for a senior white officer in 1943. It suggests that even within the segregated military, some leaders recognized the injustice of the system and were willing to challenge it, at least in limited ways. The Battle of Bamber Bridge was a small incident in the vast scope of World War II. No strategic objectives were at stake. No territory changed hands. The casualty count was minimal compared to the great battles of the war, but its significance extends far beyond its size. It was a moment when the contradictions of American democracy became impossible to ignore. It was a demonstration of black soldiers' willingness to fight for their rights, even at great personal cost. It was an example of cross-racial solidarity that transcended national boundaries. It was a crack in the edifice of segregation that would eventually help bring the whole structure down. The memorial outside Ye Olde Habe Inn ensures that this moment will not be forgotten. It stands as a reminder that the fight for justice is never finished, that ordinary people have power, that solidarity matters, and that small acts of resistance can echo through history. On June 24, 1943, in a small Lancashire village, Black American soldiers and British civilians stood together against racism and paid a price for that stand. One man died. Many were wounded. Careers were destroyed. Lives were changed forever. But they also proved something important, that resistance is possible, that solidarity is real, and that the arc of history, however slowly, bends toward justice. The Battle of Bamber Bridge changed everything because it showed what was possible. It demonstrated that the system of segregation could be challenged. It proved that white people could stand with black people against injustice. It revealed that black soldiers would not indefinitely accept second-class treatment. And it planted seeds that would eventually grow into the civil rights movement that transformed America. Today, when visitors stand before the memorial outside Ye Olde Habe Inn, they stand on ground where history was made. Not the history of great battles and famous generals, but the history of ordinary people making moral choices, of soldiers fighting for dignity as well as victory, of a community choosing justice over compliance. That history matters. It reminds us that we all face similar choices, that our actions have consequences, and that solidarity and resistance are always possible, even in the darkest times. The Battle of Bamber Bridge is over, but the struggle it represents continues. Every time someone stands up against injustice, every time a community chooses solidarity, every time people refuse to accept that discrimination is inevitable, they honor the memory of Private William Crossland and the other soldiers of the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment. They continue the fight that began on a summer night in 1943 in a small British village when black soldiers and white civilians stood together and said, "Not here, not now, not ever." If this story of courage and solidarity moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history that deserve to be remembered. We bring you the forgotten battles, the unsung heroes, and the moments that changed everything but were left out of the textbooks. Drop a comment below and let us know. Had you heard about the Battle of Bamber Bridge before? What other hidden stories from World War II should we cover next? Your support helps us continue uncovering these powerful narratives. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we explore the history they didn't teach you in school. Thank you for watching. And remember, history is made by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. What choice will you make today?